afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Luce Center for our first Conservative Women's Network event of the year. We are thrilled to have so many friends here in the audience with us and also at home. We would like to extend a huge thank you to C-SPAN for covering this event live. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I would like to take a moment to highlight some of the exciting ways we will be reaching young women across the country in the coming weeks. In 20 days in California, Alicia Krause will be speaking to students at Biola University on how modern-day feminism is anti-woman. That campus lecture is being hosted by a remarkable young woman who interned here at the Luce Center last summer. Then in Arizona, college women at Grand Canyon University will participate in a day at the range where they will receive professional firearms training to help them better understand and exercise their Second Amendment rights. And on February 14th, here at the center in Virginia, Stella Morabito will be speaking on the crucial topic of the weaponization of loneliness of women. We hope that you will return for this event where Stella will share her fascinating research on how the fear of ostracism is used to achieve social conformity. As her research and our work here at the center shows, women can resist pressure to conform if they are supported by the strong bonds of family, community, and friendship. There is one more activity that I would like to mention. We are currently interviewing candidates for our summer internship program. This is a one-of-a-kind program that our board member, Clare Luce Abbey, calls an opportunity to learn everything from constitutional law to etiquette to how to handle a firearm. If you know a young woman who would benefit from this one-of-a-kind opportunity, please encourage her to apply for our internship. Now, on to today's program. As we stand just 3 days before the inauguration of Donald Trump, the nation, and indeed the world, is watching to see what this new administration will bring. To help us unpack what lies ahead, we are honored to welcome Sarah Bedford, the investigations editor for the Washington Examiner and a Tony Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. Sarah brings with her a wealth of experience and insight. Before joining the Examiner, she worked for CNN as a White House reporter. She was a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow at the Fund for American Studies and is a graduate of Young America's Foundation's National Journalism Center. Her investigative and analytical acumen make her the perfect speaker to guide us through today's topic of what to expect from the new Trump administration. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Bedford.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. If you hear a screaming baby, that's because I'm technically still on maternity leave, so it feels really good to put on a dress and talk to grown-ups today. So thank you all. I think the biggest thing to expect from the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, overall, is that it's going to be nothing like the first in I think a lot of potentially good ways for Republicans and maybe some bad ones, some more challenging ones. Trump is coming into office now in a totally different moment, a political moment, a historical moment. His second Trump administration actually has totally different goals than the first one, even though we heard a lot of the same rhetoric on the campaign trail, right? We still heard about Make America Great Again, close the border, a lot of the same rhetoric, slogans, same hats. But the goals of the second Trump administration are totally different. And Trump also just won a completely different victory, which is going to put him in the White House on completely different footing. He won all 7 battleground states that were up for grabs. He's only the second Republican, or the first Republican president to win a popular vote victory since 1988. And that's really important because it confers so much more legitimacy on his presidency that just didn't exist in 2016 when a lot of Democrats sort of regarded his victory as an aberration that they didn't need to take seriously. That popular vote win is also, I think, really important because we just avoided what would have been a probably protracted public litigation of the Electoral College and whether it's still good for democracy. because if Trump had lost the popular vote, I think we would have heard a lot of that from Democrats. Now, Democrats really had no choice but to sort of confront the fact that Trump was actually popular this time. And we've seen that the Democratic reaction to his win this time, it was so much more blunted, even though in 2024 versus 2016, the warnings about what the second Trump administration would mean were so much more dire. It's the end of democracy. He's a dictator this time. Whereas in 2016, all we really heard were character arguments, right? He's unfit. He's a reality star. The reaction to his win this time has actually been so much more blunted. In 2016, they blamed that win on tactical errors by Hillary Clinton, or Hillary Clinton herself just wasn't good enough, and so Trump accidentally won office. But we actually don't see that much finger pointing at Kamala Harris herself, despite her being sort of a lackluster candidate, because Democrats have to contend with the fact that Trump is entering office with something of a mandate. And so there's a lot less opposition that Trump's going to have right off the bat, institutionally, from Congress, but also culturally. You know, everything from ESPN to college campuses were weaponized against Trump the first time around. And that really hampered the implementation of his agenda as he entered office the first time. This time, all of those institutions pretty much are kowtowed in a lot of ways by the nature of his victory. Trump is also entering to a totally different Washington. It's kind of hard to believe or remember this far back, but Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House, right? Adam Kinzinger was still considered representative of like mainstream Republicanism, and Liz Cheney was a member of Republican House leadership. So even though Trump came into office in 2017 for that first Trump administration with a Republican Senate and a Republican House, he really didn't have a lot of allies to put his agenda through. But this time, Mike Johnson is Speaker of the House, and he was the result of a struggle that took place before his win over how much influence MAGA was going to have in congressional leadership. Mitch McConnell is no longer the leader of the Senate. And there's been so much turnover over the past 8 years that the question of how is the Republican Party going to deal with Trumpism and with the ascendance of MAGA, that question was really open in 2016, right? We just didn't know, was Trump a blip, and were we going to return to the sort of Mitt Romney, John McCain, Chamber of Commerce type of Republican that was dominant for so many years? Were we going to return to a Tea Party era that Mike Pence was really emblematic of, or was Trumpism the future? I don't think anybody's asking that question anymore. Now we know that Trump is the future of the GOP. And so he is not going to have to contend during the second Trump administration with members of Congress who are out to obstruct his agenda. Since Trump won in 2016, 69% of the House caucus has turned over. The House Republican caucus has turned over, which means most of the Republicans who are in office right now have been elected during the Trump era. So everyone who really opposed Trump strongly has either quit because they didn't see a future or been run out of office by voters. So that's really helped to settle that question. And so, you know, that's going to give him a lot more credibility to get his legislative agenda through on Capitol Hill. But it's not clear that it's going to matter so much, even if that weren't the case, because I think one of the big things to expect, at least from the early days of the Trump administration, is that he is not going into office with a legislative agenda. He is really going into office with an executive agenda. And I think that's what a lot of Democrats were afraid of. They know that a lot of the stuff that Trump was promising to voters on the campaign trail, I'm going to close the border, I'm going to drain the swamp, got the deep state. Those are things he didn't need members of Congress to do anyway, even if Republicans hadn't retained the House and the Senate. And so he has a lot of leeway to do these things, even if that resistance was still on Capitol Hill, even if there were members of Congress who saw their future in opposing Donald Trump. And there were some Republicans who tried it unsuccessfully to make that their brand. It's not going to matter as much. When it comes to closing the border, really the only leverage right now that Congress will have to try to stop some of his immigration enforcement measures is money, as the purse strings, to try to strangle the budget at DHS. But even then, a lot of what Trump is promising to do is just to switch the enforcement priorities of DHS. We can expect the Trump administration to enforce laws that are already on the books that the Biden administration, for ideological reasons, had ignored. The Trump administration is going to end catch and release, for example. They're going to pursue expedited removals of people. In the Biden administration, we saw Biden administration officials actually suing the state of Texas for putting up physical barriers along the border, for trying to put barbed wire up, for enforcing state immigration laws, trying to argue that federal immigration laws should supersede those, potentially not realizing what kind of precedent that would set for when blue states want to start ignoring the edicts of the federal government when it comes to removing people. That could certainly be an issue that the Biden administration didn't mean to create. But nonetheless, that's not stuff that Trump needs Congress for. And so that is really going to embolden his new administration. Because if you remember in the first Trump administration, a lot of what Trump was coming into office promising to do was legislative in nature. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was his first and ultimately really only legislative accomplishment in 2017. He came in promising to repeal Obamacare, which kind of feels like a lifetime ago that was something Republicans wanted to do. But nonetheless, that was something that he spent enormous political capital trying to get through on Capitol Hill, and that was unsuccessful. And now, much of what we're going to expect to see from the Trump administration in the early days, he doesn't need Congress for. Trump has also really gotten a lot of momentum and had a really resonant message on draining the swamp or going after the so-called deep state, which if you heard the word deep state in 2016, people would sort of dismiss that as a conspiracy theorist. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. And now I think even Democrats have sort of acknowledged that the quote unquote deep state, that's sort of like a pejorative term, but that there is a class of bureaucrats who can slow roll administrations priorities that they don't like. That does exist. Now, not only have they acknowledged that it exists, they say it's an essential protection for democracy. Whereas in 2016, we saw a lot of Democrats and progressive pundits suggesting that class of bureaucrats doesn't even exist. Trump doesn't really need Congress to go after a lot of that bureaucracy. At the end of his last presidency, on October 2020, when I guess the Trump folks were hoping they were going to pull out a win there, Trump did an executive order to create something called Schedule F, which was going to reclassify some of those career positions in the federal government to be political positions, where any president, not just Trump, but any president could bring in people they wanted in some of these key policymaking roles. When Biden won, he undid it immediately. So we never got to see what the effects of that executive order would be. But that's another big plan that Trump is coming into office pledging to do. And that could cause some enormous turmoil in the way the federal government works if Trump really is able to successfully overhaul the bureaucracy as he's suggesting he could do. Because a lot of what we experience as the rules and laws in our life day to day aren't really written by Congress anymore. The regulatory state has become so powerful and so much more determinative of the ways that laws are implemented that Trump could have a really profound effect on the government if he does follow through on that civil service reform. And again, he doesn't really need Congress to do that. That's sort of what Democrats were afraid of when they said Trump was going to come in and stock the administration with loyalists. That might happen if he's able to implement those policies. Now, he's going to face a really difficult legal battle ahead. Obviously, there are activist groups on both sides, but certainly on the left, they've invested more that just exist to challenge these sorts of things in court. And we're absolutely going to expect to see that during the second Trump administration. But he has a good chance of getting some of this done. And his team has been working on what people to put in these positions and how to fill these positions for all of the 4 years that he spent in the wilderness, with the help of actual experience working in these agencies from the first Trump administration and failing in those agencies during the first Trump administration. And then I think one of the biggest opportunities for Trump to craft a real legacy here during the second Trump administration that he had no shot at during the first one is a real cultural shift that he can engender. And you're already seeing him do that. The nature of his victory, I think, created a real permission structure for companies, universities, everyday people to sort of come out and push back on some of the progressive ideologies and pieties that had really, really gained ground during the Biden years. These corporations that had adopted a lot of these DEI frameworks and a lot of this progressive marketing and sloganeering, they're starting to back away from that, I think, because the Trump win has emboldened them to walk away from things that they see now are unpopular. These corporations are risk averse. I don't think these millionaire and billionaire executives who just 10 years ago were giving money to the Romney campaign suddenly became deeply progressive. I think there was a risk aversion and a real fear there from the executives that woke mobs of consumers would hurt their businesses if they did not adopt some of these progressive policies and positioning and posturing. And now that the Trump win has actually exposed that that kind of stuff isn't popular, and the free market has spoken, products and movies and all sorts of things that are really deeply progressive have become really unpopular. But I think that Trump has a real opportunity to push that cultural shift even further. And again, he doesn't need anyone in Washington for that. And that is, I think, a big part of what progressives were so nervous about when he was running for office in 2024. And then in Washington, this new sea of allies that he has on Capitol Hill is also going to be really important for avoiding some of the biggest pitfalls of 2016, which were the investigations, the impeachments, the subpoenas. All of those really hindered his ability to get anything done for the second 2 years of his administration when Republicans lost their majorities in the 2018 midterms. That is not going to happen this time around, so long as there are Republican majorities on Capitol Hill. Even if there aren't, there's not going to be a sizable number of Republicans willing to go along with that the way they were in 2016. In 2016, Trump had really spent a lot of the political capital that he had, to the extent that he had any. By the time the 2018 midterms rolled around, there weren't a lot of Republicans willing to stand up and say, we're not doing this. When the FBI went to those Republicans on the Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee and such in 2016 and said, hey, we think Trump colluded with Russia, there was a lot of Republicans who took that seriously and said, oh my gosh, really? We have to investigate that. In 2021, when the FBI raids Mar-a-Lago, there is no more credibility left for those investigative agencies among Republicans. And so Democrats may have put themselves in a kind of boy who cried wolf situation for the second Trump administration. Even if Trump were to do something actually like legit corrupt in his first few years, Democrats have sort of spent all of that monopoly money on trying to go after Donald Trump. There's not an appetite for it among Republicans and certainly among Democrats, especially in those vulnerable swing states. There's not going to be an appetite for going after Trump on things in that regard either. So I think that in the second Trump administration, we can expect Donald Trump to be insulated from a lot of those types of problems that really hurt him the first time around. And we're also seeing Trump make very different personnel decisions, which is a huge deal. That everything flows from the people that a president has around him. In 2016, Donald Trump was still considered a fluke, even after he won the election. Forget about the Republican primaries when there were not a lot of capable or well-established GOP operatives who were willing to join the Trump campaign because they thought that it was kind of like an accident that he won the GOP primary and that he was definitely going to lose an embarrassing defeat. And the Access Hollywood tape really just solidified for all those Republicans that they made the right decision not to jump on board. And so when it came to the transition, there was a real scramble. Donald Trump didn't have anyone in the political orbit the way that, normally by the time a politician arrives at a transition period and becomes a president-elect, they've worked in politics for years. They have people from their old congressional office that they know in Washington. They have people from their Senate office or when they were governor. Donald Trump didn't have anyone. He had people who worked for him on like The Apprentice and in the Trump Steakhouse. So he had to create a team out of nothing really, really fast. And as we saw, it kind of led to a disaster, for lack of a better word. There was constantly stories about staff infighting, people not getting along. Trump had no privacy to vet his ideas because every meeting was leaked to the media and his unvarnished opinions. And we all know that Trump is like a barely varnished in public, so let alone behind closed doors. That was all leaking and really undermining his first administration right from the jump. We're not seeing that this time because different personnel decisions were made. And this time, Trump is prioritizing loyalty over pedigree when he's choosing people, which the media portrays as a bad thing. That Trump is, like I mentioned earlier, creating this army of loyalists, and that's what dictators do. But every president brings loyal staffers into office with him and stocks his cabinet with people who support his agenda. That's just how it's always worked. But, with Trump, it's being sort of framed as this terrible thing that he's doing. When Biden does it, when Obama does it, it's just strategic choices. So that's a different rant on the media for a different time. But when he was making cabinet decisions in 2016, pedigree was really important to him. You think back to like Rex Tillerson, who was his first Secretary of State. There were reports that Donald Trump had never even spoken to Rex Tillerson before he asked him to be his Secretary of State. But Rex Tillerson was from Central Casting, right? He was the CEO of ExxonMobil, so he had all this international experience. Dealing in business, was the type of person that Trump envisioned would be good at Secretary of State, but not someone who he really thought about, would this person be good to promote the America First foreign policy agenda? And that sort of logic played with a lot of the personnel decisions that Donald Trump made the first time around. Would this person make a good central casting pick for this position? Not, is this person right to promote my agenda in this position? Now, the adherence and the fealty to the MAGA agenda is the biggest priority that the Trump administration is thinking through when they're making these personnel decisions. And that, you're already seeing a smoother confirmation process. Democrats didn't really lay a glove on the nominees who have gone through their confirmation hearings so far, because these nominees are better prepared. And they have answers for all the questions that Democrats are asking. And that's not really what we saw the first time around. So those personnel decisions are really important. And it's also a reflection of how Trump's team spent their 4 years in the wilderness, which is making a huge impact on how they're all entering office again. In 2016, when Donald Trump won, there was no ideological infrastructure for MAGA. It wasn't even really considered an ideology. I mean, part of the problem that Trump had was a lot of the people who he surrounded himself with were Republicans, but they just saw Trump as an empty vessel, who just as like a reality star who accidentally won, and they projected all of what they wanted onto him. Well, he has Mike Pence, so he must be a social conservative. Let's get him to do that. Well, he has a business background. He must be a Mitt Romney Chamber of Commerce Republican. Let's get him to do that kind of stuff. But there weren't really Republicans who came from a background of running on, being elected on, promoting the populist right agenda that Donald Trump won on. And so the implementation of it was sort of scattershot in 2016, and there wasn't the outside infrastructure in Washington to support it. The think tanks, the lobbying shops of Washington people who make an administration run. This time, in the second Trump administration, all of that exists now. In the 4 years since Trump was in office, the people who were with him last time took those jobs, created those think tanks. And so you had sort of incubators for talent for those lower level positions. There's a lot of attention that gets paid to the cabinet nominees. Those are really important. But arguably some of the more important decisions are who gets the undersecretary roles, the deputy undersecretary of whatever role. Whoever has that actually has a lot of power over the day-to-day stuff that the administration is doing. And one thing the Trump administration was not prepared to do last time was to fill all of the thousands of political appointee positions down the line under cabinet. And they sort of had to scramble to find people. Many of them never got filled. So they got held in acting capacities by career bureaucrats who didn't support the Trump administration, who were able to slow walk it. Now, the 4 years that Trump spent out of power, his team vetted resumes, went over what did we do wrong in the Energy Department, Bureau of Energy Affairs. What did we do wrong there? Who are the people there who really need to be MAGA, need to be with us to get our agenda done? Who slow walked us? How do we remake each of these little offices that we have experience with? So, and also the crop of think tanks that grew up around Trump has a million white papers to help implement that. So Trump goes into office now with the support of an infrastructure that simply didn't exist in 2016. And so I think you can expect a lot more cohesion from the policy standpoint that Trump will be putting out because of the personnel. And so that's kind of a lot of the ways that the second Trump administration is going to be different. The why did we get here? Like, why does Trump have the wind at his back so much is still, we've all been talking about it for 10 weeks and it's still hard to put a finger on. My husband and I were talking about this last night, and we've been talking about it for so long, and it's still hard to put a finger on that. How did Trump become such a credible figure overnight? He has a credibility to him now that didn't exist at any point in his political career. And I think, a big part of what has helped create that is not stuff that he's done recently, but the events that have transpired since he was in office have validated a lot of the things that he was talking about in 2016 that were dismissed as sort of the ramblings of the Apprentice host, and now have validated his warnings. You know, he said that if you stopped doing the immigration enforcement measures that the left and the media had portrayed as barbaric, you would have an invasion of migrants. The border would be open. If we don't separate families, if we don't continue remain in Mexico and all of these policies that Democrats explicitly railed against, you're going to see an influx of migrants. And people said that's not true. He just, is a racist and wants to crack down on the border. But events since then have validated what Trump warned about on the border. And so people the second time around took it as a credible threat, what Trump was saying about the border. Trump spent a lot of his 2020 campaign talking about how the Democrats were going after him. They're out to get him. They've weaponized these investigative agencies against me. Voters didn't want to hear it back then. That's a big part of why he lost in 2020, is that his 2020 campaign was completely consumed by grievances of what had been done to him, from the Ukraine phone call impeachment and the Russiagate and the investigations of his children, Ivanka and Jared. He complained a lot about how everyone was out to get him, and voters didn't want to hear it. And that's part of why he lost. Fast forward 4 years of a couple clearly politically motivated Democratic prosecutors in Manhattan and Georgia, and what appeared to be what you could arguably call a politically motivated investigation out of Biden's Justice Department against Donald Trump for crimes that had never been prosecuted against anyone, let alone someone who had been a sitting president at the time. When Trump complained this time around in 2024 on the campaign trail, they're out to get me, all of a sudden voters took that as a credible line as well when they didn't before. And Trump also spent a lot of the 4 years warning, if you have weak leadership at the head of the United States, if you're not an unpredictable strongman of sorts as president, other countries will take advantage of the US and you'll have chaos. And again, we heard a lot of dismissal of this. Trump's just talking like a strong man, like a dictator and authoritarian. Before Trump left office after his defeat in 2020, world events have kind of underscored that Donald Trump was onto something when he said you do need to have unpredictability and a real strength of personality, not just, of strength of bureaucracy at the helm of the United States. We've seen it embolden Iran, arm all these proxies throughout the Middle East and add to this chaos significantly. After Trump had spent a lot of his political capital, and a big part of his foreign policy was bringing Iran to heel, exiting JCPOA, and all of the stuff that he said he was going to do with Iran. And Putin invaded Ukraine when Trump was out of power. And the Afghanistan thing is just a mess that we all remember. So Trump's foreign policy warnings also came to pass. And so I think because all of these events that transpired during the Biden administration has retroactively validated everything Trump said, people took Trump so much more seriously in 2024, and that's going to make a huge difference for people taking seriously when he does things in his next administration. I think the assassination attempts in July sort of crystallized how he went kind of overnight, it feels like, from someone who is the butt of a lot of jokes to someone who is considered a really serious figure by millions more people than ever before. All of the Democratic attacks can kind of be distilled down to going after Trump's strength of character, right? They say at his heart, he's a weak, pampered, rich man. He doesn't care about you. He's racist. All of these things that really get at Donald Trump's character. But after that assassination attempt, when Trump jumped off and pumped his fists, and it was like the craziest thing that anyone had ever seen on the campaign trail, that strength of character argument kind of fell apart. Democrats just could no longer go after Donald Trump and say he is this weak monster at heart. And it sort of unlocked this endearing side to Trump that brings him into office not as the butt of Saturday Night Live jokes, not as the butt of all the late night TV show rants. That cultural and institutional shift in attitude towards him is going to make the context around the start of his first administration so different. I mean, he has real celebrities performing at his inauguration on Monday. They couldn't get anyone to sing at the 2016 inauguration. They couldn't fill the VIP seats. Now you have the CEOs of all the Fortune 500 companies donating to his inaugural campaign and sitting in those seats, filling them, because Trump is a serious, legitimate force in a way that he's never been before heading into the 2024, his second administration. But I do think there's still going to be a lot of challenges for him that we can expect to see in 2024. And I think one of the biggest ones is that the deportations are not going to be pretty. That's going to be an emotional thing for people to see on the news. You remember there was this image during the 2017 administration of this little girl, and she was crying and she was in the headlights of a DHS car. And I worked at CNN. We broadcast that picture every night for weeks. It was iconic and it really moved people. People were really disturbed. And, in some ways, rightfully so, by these images of families being torn apart because of the deportation priorities of the Trump administration. And Trump is coming in saying it's going to be so much more aggressive this time. We're going to take people who are living in the United States already. The media will find examples of people who have integrated into their communities, who have started families here, who are getting removed. That's going to be hard. Can Republicans, when those images start hitting the news and the front of newspapers every night and it starts moving people emotionally, can Republicans in swing districts hold fast to the unity that they seem to have right now on immigration enforcement? Or will he start to lose support in his party and support from the voters? Right now, they say they want this, right? They're seeing the tent cities that are popping up in the metro areas where migrants are being bused. They're seeing the negative effects. When they start seeing the deportations, is that going to crack Republican unity? I think there's a good chance it might. And it's not going to be as easy as it looks right now for Donald Trump to enact specifically the removal portion of his immigration enforcement. Donald Trump right now has created a big tent, which we've talked about as sort of a good thing in terms of Republican unity for the GOP, to have all of these Republicans unified behind a figure who finally has legitimacy to lead the party, something that he's been striving for unsuccessfully for 8 years, and he finally has it. But you're already seeing those cracks start to form. Think about the debate over H-1B visas that we just saw a few weeks ago, that some of people who are considered really close Trump allies, like Vivek Ramaswamy, going on and undermining some of the central message of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, saying we need to import more skilled laborers to take jobs that are being held by Americans or could be held by Americans so corporations can pay them less. This debate over the merits of the H-1B system, which does bring skilled and capable immigrants to the United States, and legal immigration has long been a priority of Republicans. Is that a good thing, or does it go against the MAGA agenda? Debates like that are going to get messy once Trump is in office and has a chance to start enacting some of this stuff. You see the battle between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, in a tent that big, you're going to have a lot of heads butting. And even though we might not see that playing out through the tabloids the way we did during the first Trump administration, you may see some Republicans start to splinter once we start enacting some of these policies. And then I think Trump's win also papered over some debates that Republicans kind of agreed to a ceasefire of sorts on in 2024. Abortion, for example. Republicans have not found a path forward politically in the post-Roe landscape. And there was sort of an agreement that all the Republicans were going to kind of shut up and line up behind Trump's states' rights. Let's let the states decide line on abortion to sort of neutralize what was the biggest Democratic attack in that area, which is that Trump was going to ban all abortions. Now, though, that Trump is in power and Republicans have both houses of Congress and Republicans gained seats in state houses, and they're in a position to start actually grappling with this idea of what do we do now that we have the Dobbs decision, that is also potentially going to be a big challenge for the Trump administration. Let's say that Congress does pass a 15-week abortion ban, which is something that Senator Lindsey Graham had introduced, which a lot of Republicans had gotten behind. It is actually really popular. Voters say they like restrictions somewhere after the first trimester like that. Let's say a 15-week abortion ban gets to Trump's desk. Does he sign it? He said he won't, but it would be an opportunity that conservatives would absolutely leap at the chance to have a national abortion restriction of that caliber. So how does Trump handle when those sorts of policies reach him, given the line he's threaded on abortion? Those unsettled debates are going to be a big challenge for Donald Trump. Also, in this second Trump administration, because of all of those stars aligning for him coming into office, there's not going to be excuses for things not getting done this time around. He failed to do some of the things he said that he was going to do in 2016, and you can credibly make the argument that events precluded him from fulfilling a lot of his agenda items, that the Russia investigation, that COVID, all of those things hamstrung him from the very beginning. The institutional and cultural resistance to him prevented him from having any public goodwill that a winner of a presidential election usually has something of a honeymoon period. Trump had none. The Women's March was the same weekend as the 2016 inauguration. There was never even one single moment where he was going to be given the benefit of the doubt by anyone but his own loyal supporters. He's going in with a huge benefit of the doubt, which means in the start of this second Trump administration, if he fails to get some of the stuff over the finish line, if he waters down some of these priorities because of the people he has around him, because of the corporate money and the embrace by corporate America that he has enjoyed, and waters down some of those policies to appease all of his new supporters and friends, there's not going to be really anyone to blame but the Trump administration. So that is, I think, going to be a huge challenge for him, is that he's in an amazing spot to deliver, but now he has to deliver in order to give MAGA a chance to last beyond him. Because the next question will be, who is his successor after this? A lot of people would, I think, rightfully say J.D. Vance, the vice president, his probably arguably the most articulate defender of the MAGA agenda that we've seen besides Trump himself. You could actually make the argument that J.D. Vance is slightly more articulate in the rhetorical department than Donald Trump. But there will be a huge battle for who gets to be the successor to MAGA and what MAGA looks like in the future after Donald Trump. And this is it. We've seen the last Donald Trump campaign we'll ever see. We're going to see the last Donald Trump inauguration on Monday that we'll ever see. So Donald Trump is in a lot of ways going to be in legacy mode for these 4 years. That's a totally different footing than he was the first time around, when there's always one eye of a first-term president towards their next run. Trump has no eyes on his next run. So he can set MAGA up to succeed beyond him, or he can hamper its future with how he performs in the second administration. So that will be sort of one of the defining questions of the second administration as we look forward to Monday. Thanks. That's it.
We now have time for a few questions. So if you have a question for Sarah, just raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic.
Thank you. That was brilliantly put, and I enjoyed it very
thanks.
much. One thing that is already concerning me is this need to make the tax cuts permanent. And I understand that. But I'm already seeing President Trump bend towards the Republicans in the caucus, such as Mike Lawler, who are hung up on the SALT element. And that is part of the tax bill that I fully support. Why should people in Nebraska who pay $600 a year for their property taxes subsidize Greenwich, Connecticut with their huge property taxes? And he's already indicated, yeah, let's find a better number on SALT. Well, you can't give in to everybody, and they won't vote for the tax cuts unless he gives in. So where do we go from there?
That has always been one of the biggest challenges Republicans have had with Donald Trump, right? Is that he is not, in his heart, an ideological person on a lot of these issues. He's very tactical, right? How do we get this bill over the finish line? He's willing to do the horse trading that someone like a Mike Pence, who's way more driven by ideology, isn't willing to do. Now, voters have signaled they're really tired of the ideological purists on the right? They were ready for some leadership that was willing to just get some things over the finish line. But that has in the past and will probably during the second Trump administration result in some compromises that make conservatives uncomfortable, because Donald Trump doesn't think like a lot of the life issue. I think is a great example of that as well, where Donald Trump is not a pro-life person at his heart, right? He never has been. He's always been a pro-choice figure. And because of that, he was willing to sort of make compromises on that issue that made conservatives uncomfortable, because he's just looking for the wins and let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. What can we get done here? And so that's often been his approach legislatively as well, to the ire of a lot of Republicans, because he'll come out and undermine negotiating positions of congressional leadership with a single tweet, And so with the tax issue, a lot of political capital was spent on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. There's a reason why that was one of his only legislative accomplishments, or really policy accomplishments from the first Trump administration that lasted, was because it was a bitter fight. It was tough to herd the cats on Capitol Hill. Now, like we just talked about, he's in a lot better position because there's not that many Republicans left who openly oppose him. But people like Mike Lawler is in a New York House district that is very swingy. He is constantly at risk every 2 years of not getting reelected. And with a House majority as thin as it is right now, every single vulnerable member gets to have their voice heard, because even a couple of votes lost means legislative isn't getting through. So Mike Lawler and other swing district Republicans have an enormous amount of leverage on that sort of thing. And because Donald Trump doesn't have the ideological mooring for these sorts of issues, on taxes, he likes to say, I'm rich. I have tons of practice avoiding paying taxes through the loopholes, so I know all about it. And so there could be some Republicans who are set up for disappointment there, because Donald Trump ultimately is about notching wins in that department.
Thanks for your talk. Very, very informative. I think most of us are reassured by the idea that the Trump team has spent the last 4 years vetting resumes, as you said, so that more people will be in those powerful undersecretary positions. However, how do you reconcile that with the need to really trim back a lot of this incredible administrative overgrowth? How do you see the Trump administration reconciling those two positions, having people that share our values in those positions of power while simultaneously trying to claw back this incredibly overgrown federal bureaucracy?
I think that's one of the sort of really interesting tensions between MAGA Trumpism and what would be considered traditional Tea Party conservatism, because what you don't hear a lot from Trump and MAGA Republicans is we need to cut the size of government. We need to cut spending. We need to, fiscal responsibility. That's actually not one of the hallmarks of Trump populist conservatism. And that's part of why Trump had so much resistance when he first came into power in the Republican Party, because he didn't prioritize those same things that Republicans did before. What you hear a lot of rhetorically about the bureaucracy, as you say, is let's make the bureaucracy work for us from the Trump administration. Let's turn these levers of power to work to implement goals. So it's more of an ends-driven ideology and agenda than a means-driven one. And so because of that, there is a fear among some conservatives that you're not going to see the size of the federal government trimmed significantly. You do have Doge from Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy as sort of an effort to appease, I think, Republicans who are concerned that you're not going to see a prioritization of cutting spending and reining in the big government. But how empowered is that office going to be? Is this just sort of a lip service to that goal? You might see the Trump administration trim some of those positions through attrition. I've heard some talk about that, but short of that, I don't think that's a stated goal of the Trump administration, and something that once we get past these 4 years and we have these conversations about what does America First ideology look like heading into the future, that's going to be one of the questions for Trump's successor is, can you marry that old school conservatism with the populism that's ascendant right now?
Thank you for being here during your important family time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Do you think Trump 2.0 and the new focus of the second administration is possible without those 4 years in the wilderness, as you called it? Would they have learned any lessons without it?
That's a great point. No, I don't think that it could be possible. I think if Trump had won in 2020, he would have won by the skin of his teeth, right? It was a very thin margin. So he would not have had the goodwill that he has now. The sort of transformation of the Republican Party wouldn't have been complete. Part of what completed and cemented the status of America First as the absolute top of the Republican Party is the primary process we went through in 2020. Voters had a chance to select someone else, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, as the future of the Republican Party. They had every reason to, for some, and they didn't, proving that what voters want is the Trump agenda. Now, that we wouldn't have had that sort of process to validate for Republicans that this is the future that voters want if Trump hadn't had to undergo the primary process in 2020. He wouldn't be coming in, like you said, with the personnel infrastructure that he has. And the 4 years of the Biden administration were, I think, absolutely critical for showing voters why they wanted Donald Trump in office. The inflation that we saw, the multiple foreign policy crises that happened under Joe Biden, the fact of Joe Biden's age and the frankly, cover-up that was engaged in by the government and the media also validated a lot of what Trump was saying about the corrupt government and the corrupt media. And without those things happening to voters and voters living that experience and then seeing Trump sweep the primaries in 2024, then he wouldn't be coming into office in anywhere near the same position. He would have had to preside over the COVID recovery had he won. He would have had to own the problem of inflation. I don't think he would have made it potentially as bad as President Biden has with some of his inflationary policies, but there would have been inflation and it would have been blamed on Trump. And so he didn't have any of that baggage coming into 2024. Thank you.
Stay up here for just 1 minute,
Sure.
Sarah.
Thanks.
We have a wonderful tradition here at the Luce Center. Get on the side of you. We have our Yeti mug with our favorite statement from Clare Boothe Luce. Would you like to read it for everyone?
Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is. Thank
and
you.
as a new and recent mom with a newborn, you can use this for your coffee.
I'll need it.
So-
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
And we're hoping that Sarah will join us, her husband here and her baby, and we have a wonderful lunch for you all right outside. So I look forward to chatting with you all out in the hallway. Thank you so much.